Ruthless PoE is a completely different animal than the base game. A lot of stuff is different, and it's just not for everybody. And that's evidenced by how few people are playing it. Right now, I'm really interested in the game mode and have been playing it for a while, but there's really no resources available for people to look at and kind of learn about what the game mode is and how to succeed. So I'm making this video as a kind of signpost for people to come to, and maybe they can learn a couple useful pieces of advice from my experience playing, and I hope that it can serve as a kind of jumping in point to understanding what the game mode is, and maybe it can help some people decide if they'd even like to try it at all. I'd like to share with you guys some of the lessons that I've learned and some general advice on how to succeed in Ruthless. So let me first start off by talking about what is Ruthless. Ruthless, it has extreme item scarcity, meaning that you'll get much less items than normal, much less currency than normal. Things that are very, very rare in Ruthless are jewelry. You will very likely complete a lot of the campaign without having rings equipped or an amulet or a belt equipped. Crafting is much, much worse, namely because you get a lot less currency, but the systems are changed in a couple meaningful ways as well. Things like essences normally you can use to reroll rare items. So in the core game, often very good items are created by having an item with a fractured modifier and then having an essence or fossil used on them to then guarantee or much more likely create different affixes to appear on the item. In Ruthless, deterministic crafting materials like essences and fossils can only be used on normal items. That means that no fractured item crafting is available, and you can only expect to essence a normal item to rare. And all of those materials are significantly rarer in Ruthless than they are in the core game. There's also no crafting bench, so you can never craft any kind of modifier on any piece of gear. You cannot craft resistances on your gear while progressing through the campaign to shore up your resistances. And yeah, having no crafting bench really significantly changes the way that you create items in PoE. There's an extreme XP penalty. This doesn't really become too apparent until you start reaching later in the game, but as you approach level 90, it becomes more and more difficult to gain experience, especially if you're not sustaining and farming high tier maps. So planning your character to kind of cap out level wise in the 80s to level 90 is not a bad idea, instead of your typical kind of planning and path of building where you might expect to fairly easily reach level 90, the mid 90s, even if you're a pretty efficient player. That's going to be very difficult to do. Currently in hardcore trade Ruthless, there's only 2 level 95 characters, and that's definitely not for lack of amount of time playing or efficient playing. It's just that you get much, much less experience as you gain levels in Ruthless. There's some reduced character power in Ruthless through the fact that you don't have a movement skill. You can't expect to avoid attacks by instantly teleporting, and you can't expect to gain the amount of survivability that you gain in the normal game by being able to reposition your character instantly. And you also have 2 less ascendancy points. Completing Uber Labyrinth doesn't grant you any ascendancy points, so after you complete Merciless Labyrinth, you have all of the ascendancy character power that you'll have for the rest of the game. This makes a lot of ascendancies worse, and it makes some ascendancies much more appealing. So when you're planning your character, you have to plan it to have 6 ascendancy points total. The Atlas system is restructured in a few meaningful ways. The first being that maps themselves have completely different stats than in the base game, which I'll touch on all this a little more in detail later, but that changes a lot. The Atlas passive tree is redesigned in some ways. The passives are completely different. In some ways, they're very similar or completely the same, but generally they offer you less rewards for each point. There is no plus tier to all maps from Voidstones like you would expect in the normal game. In core PoE, you complete 4 void stones and all of the maps on your atlas are tier 16. That does not occur in Ruthless. Each void stone does not increase the level of maps by any amount. So the maps and what tier they are at is completely set in stone from the beginning to your very end game progression. League content rewards are very, very different. Generally, they are much less powerful than they are in the base game. Things like Expedition could really basically create your entire character for you in core PoE. You can create amazing items with Rog, gamble lots of uniques with Gwenin at a reduced rate these days, of course, but those are a lot worse in Ruthless. They generally offer you normal items, well, not normal items, mostly magic items, and then rarely rare items, and they don't offer you lots of currency like they normally do. For instance, a ritual altar, typically you would open one in the core game and you'd see synthesized items, you'd see currency, you'd see maybe maps, uniques, things like that. If you open a ritual altar in Ruthless, it just has a bunch of magic items and maybe, if you're lucky, a rare item. So I played on hardcore trade in Ruthless, so this is kind of from my perspective as a hardcore player. For people who are playing on softcore, basically the major differences that you don't have to think about is building your character for survivability and slowing your progression so you don't die. But for hardcore players, here's the problems that you really have to solve. And the first being getting through the campaign with practically no items and skill gems. You very rarely get support gems. You do not get to purchase support gems from vendors. You are allowed to purchase 2 total active skill gems through progressing the campaign from Ciosa in the library. But other than that, you don't get to buy any skill gems from the vendor. You get 1 token for completing Ciosa's quest and 1 token for killing Innocents, which you can trade for 2 total active skill gems per character. Progressing through maps is difficult comparatively to the core game. You are kind of flooded with a lot of maps currently in the Forbidden Sanctum build of PoE, and you really don't have to think too much about progressing your Atlas. It's very slow in Ruthless compared to that. Much less maps drop, and mostly that's due to the fact that there are much less monsters in your maps due to the changes in to the maps as items. You have to think about building character power over a much longer time span. Instead of being able to get determination and grace and having all those things in Act 3 and then blasting through the campaign and then going in straight into maps with all the character power that you gain from those auras, you are not going to have those things until much later. And likewise, you're not going to have as good items as you would have due to the scarcity in items and the unavailability of crafting in Ruthless. So you have to think about being able to survive over a much longer time span while having much less character power. This means that you have to progress slowly, and you have to make sure that at any given point you feel very confident before moving up in steps of difficulty or putting your character in a risky position, because you're going to lose your character in those positions. You're going to be much weaker for much longer, and it's going to take you many more maps, many more monster kills, many more boss kills to reach a power level that you would have expected to see in a much shorter time span in base PoE. So getting through the campaign, you got to go slow. That's really the name of the game. You want to overfarm and overpower the campaign by doing a lot of farming in zones. Some of the zones that I specifically farmed a lot on my first character were the Dried Lake, because there's a lot of kind of squishy monsters there, and killing Vol and killing bosses, they have higher rarity than monsters significantly, so your chance to get rare items from them is pretty good, and kind of repetitively killing them and trying to get rare items for your character and upgrades is a really good idea. Chests in the campaign are really good. Zones with lots of interactables offer you a good opportunity to click on them and get more items from those. I spent a lot of time in the Reliquary in both Act 5 and Act 10 farming for items. and that helped my character a lot. I got support gems, I got active skill gems, and I got items from those chests that really helped improve my character. So as far as your kind of like clear speed and how many items you get per hour, zones with lots of chests offer you a much better opportunity to do that. Making mules to get more skill gem purchases from Ciosa can be a really valuable idea based on how you're designing your character. If you need multiple active skill gems, like if you're a minion build, for instance, that's going to utilize raise zombies, summon raging spirits, maybe absolution, multiple different minions, or if you're a righteous fire character that needs righteous fire, fire trap, searing bond is a good ability to use because you need to find as many kind of like vectors to deal damage in Ruthless, since you're not going to have all the support gems to improve your damage. So having multiple skills that deal damage, if you're able to with your build, is a really good idea. And you can get those things guaranteed by creating mules and getting to Ciosa and purchasing the gems that you need from him. So getting through the campaign, you're then faced with maps which are different in some ways and the same in many. Here's a map that I've rolled on Ruthless. You can see at the top, the quantity is still there. The rarity is no longer there, the increased item rarity of items found. And most importantly, the pack size is not there. There is no pack size modifier to your map, which is a really, really big difference between core PoE and Ruthless. So there is a lot less monsters in your map than normal, and the intrinsic pack size of each map matters a lot more. Things like Strand that normally have, basically 0 monsters, and then you can get a bunch of pack size on them to make them a little more tolerable. You have no opportunity to do that. So you would prefer to be running maps that have a lot more monsters in them at a base level in Ruthless. And you can see that this map has a lot of rippy modifiers on it. 100% AoE and 2 projectiles. I guess not a lot, but it has some. And you don't really get that much benefit for it. So rolling your maps and alchemying them is pretty much not worth it. Especially because alchemy orbs are extremely rare, and spending your currency to make sure your map is runnable is generally a very big waste of your currency. So you'll often just be transmuting your maps and leaving them as is, maybe augment orbing them if you feel confident in doing that, or if you have an abundance of them. But generally just transmuting your maps and sticking them in the map device is what you'll be doing, especially from a hardcore perspective, to make sure you stay alive. You'll notice at the top there's a stat that is not in core PoE that's called map drop chance. This increases the chance that a monster would drop a map, and it's good and it's important, and it's the most kind of appealing reason to alchemy your maps or to roll them, is to get more maps from the map. But it's not really 100% essential. A much more meaningful stat that I'll talk about in a little bit is additional chance for a map to drop as a higher tier. So the Atlas passive tree, firstly, League content appears differently. If you want to know the kind of nitty-gritty specifics about this stuff, I really recommend that you read the Ruthless changes that are documented in the patch notes. But to summarize it kind of quickly, when a map is created, it rolls to see if there is a League content period. Normally in PoE, it rolls a % chance for each piece of League content to appear. Instead, in Ruthless, it rolls a flat chance for any content to appear. After that point, it then rolls a chance for which piece of content it is. This can be modified on the Atlas passive tree through nodes that have increased chance for something to occur, like 25% increased chance for abysses to appear in your maps. But that 25% chance for it to appear doesn't actually increase the frequency it appears in your maps. It only increases the chance that it's chosen if the map decides to have a piece of League content in it. Likewise, the nodes that normally would restrict content from appearing in your maps that you can choose to block content, they basically just say that things do not appear, which means that if you block all but one piece of League content, what will occur is that the map will check to see if it has League content, and if it does, it will always be that piece of League content. So blocking League content is really good in Ruthless, especially if you're looking to target something specific to do or to avoid rippy pieces of League content that you don't want to be doing. Master missions, for the most part, are pretty much unchanged in Ruthless, and I would say that master missions are the most powerful thing that you can be doing in the end game in Ruthless. Namely, Alva is extremely useful for progressing your maps. Getting the map room in your temple is very, very nice, and the Alva zone itself offers you a really good opportunity to farm a large zone with a large amount of monsters, and depending on the rooms you've chosen, potentially increased item quantity, increased monster pack size, and things like that. Your character needs to be powerful enough to do that content, of course, but if you're able to do it, it's very, very useful. And you can use Alva as a kind of gateway between tiers of maps as well. For instance, if you have 2 Alva missions that are white and 1 Alva mission that is yellow, and you're trying to progress through yellow maps, you can run those 2 white missions and then run that 1 Alva mission in the highest possible map that you have. In that Alva zone that's created, the temple zone, will be the highest monster level that you have, which means that when you go in there and you're killing all the monsters, of which there are quite a bit of monsters in the temple compared to normal map, you'll be able to drop higher tier maps, and that'll help you a lot progressing through the maps. I used that to get through the map tiers, and it was very, 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 very useful for me. So speccing in the Atlas passive tree into increased chance of getting these master missions is a really good idea. Namely, like I said, Alva is in my opinion, the best starting one to do, but of course be warned that Alva is pretty scary from a hardcore perspective. The monsters in there can kill you. They often do multiple projectiles that do chaos damage and things like that, so you have to be very cautious of that. The thing that's different on Ruthless that you could see here is that there are nodes that have a chance for maps found to be 1 tier higher. Some of them, like the small ones on the right here, have no downside. They just give you a flat 2% chance for the map to be 1 tier higher when it drops. And then some of these notable ones that are available to you have a generic downside, like monsters deal 15% extra physical damage as lightning. So those are pretty appealing to take, but you do have to be aware that they do have downsides that can make the map more dangerous to you. And having this chance for maps to drop plus tier higher is totally essential for progressing through the Atlas. You can also get that stat on Void Stones, which I'll show right here. So like I said earlier, Void Stones don't increase the tiers of your maps, but they do give you this 25% chance to be 1 tier higher. This is basically worth 2.5 notable passive points, or I believe it's 13 small passive points. So they're very valuable as far as sustaining higher tier maps. And you can get 2 of these from killing the Eater of Worlds and Searing Exarch. That's not an easy task to do with no movement skill, no doubt, on hardcore, but they're fairly attainable. There are some ways that you can build your character to kind of mitigate those encounters when you don't have a movement skill, but they are difficult, and you do have to beat the predecessor bosses to them to do them, which are also pretty scary on hardcore. And then after that, you get 1 from killing the Maven, which is pretty difficult, and 1 from killing the Uber Elder, which I would say is even more difficult from a hardcore perspective. So you probably won't have any of these Void Stones for a very long time when you're progressing the maps, so it's important that you spend your Atlas points in a way that maximizes the amount of additional chance to be 1 tier higher you get, and master missions. League content, like I said earlier, is a lot worse. So spending your time investing your points into league content probably isn't a good idea until you're fairly deep into maps and really have your kind of foothold in what you're doing there. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about bossing with no move skills and my experience with that. So far, I've killed Uber Elder, Maven, both of the campaign bosses, the Cortex, Uber Siri. So I've done some pretty difficult content. I haven't done any of the Uber bosses like Uber Shaper, Uber Elder, or anything like that, nor do I think I will, because I think that without a movement skill, they are extremely difficult and your character needs to be very powerful, and I'm not sure that, even if I had 2 more months to just sit around and play, I could build a character that's powerful enough to do them. So firstly, my philosophy is that you need to build to tank the mechanics. If you're going into the fight and you cannot tank a majority of the mechanics in the fight, I don't think you should go into it in hardcore. That's just a general good rule of thumb. But it's even more so important here because you do not have the ability to dodge things with Flame Dash like you would normally. You cannot rely on your good mechanical skill to avoid those attacks and survive. They will hit you and you will die if you cannot basically just ignore them. For the mechanics that you can't ignore and you do need to avoid, movement speed is so extremely important. And movement speed is even more important from a long-term perspective of progressing your character as well, not just in bossing, because your time to move through the map is much more valuable in Ruthless than it is in the base game, because normally in the base game you would be killing screens with 10-20 times as many monsters as in Ruthless, and that's just not the case in Ruthless. Instead, it's much better to complete maps quicker by having lots of movement speed than it is to run these juicy maps, because you can't run juicy maps in Ruthless. They don't exist, pretty much. There's ways to add more monsters to your maps in Ruthless through things like scarabs or influences, but they are much worse than in the normal game, and you will not be able to constantly sustain them like you do in the normal game. This really isn't different in Ruthless, but dealing damage while moving is just OP. And in Ruthless, it's even more important that you're able to deal damage while moving on these bosses, because you do not get to stand around in DPS and then right before the attack happens teleport. You have to basically be constantly moving, so that way when the attack appears, you are already in the progress of traveling out of the area of danger. And yeah, that's basically the tips and advice that I have to give on this. If there's any further questions that you have, please leave a comment on this video and I'll try and get to it and respond to any questions that are posted. I really love Ruthless, and I really hope that they continue support on it. And I might make some other videos later talking about, some suggestions or feedback that I have in the game mode. But yeah, hopefully this has been useful for you guys, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.